Welcome to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're excited to have guest Sadie Jones, an ex-BigLaw recruiter, here with us to talk about the strategic decisions you're going to need to make during OCI. Your Law School Toolbox host today is Alison Monahan, and normally I'm with Lee Burgess, my co-host. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so that you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. Together with the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started. Looking for help on the OCI process? Check out our offerings at careerdicta.com. We can help you get your resume in order, advise on bidding strategy, help you prep for interviews, and more. Visit careerdicta.com today to get started. Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're excited to have guest Sadie Jones, an ex-BigLaw recruiter, here to talk with us about the strategic decisions you need to make during OCI. So first off, let's talk about the basics. What is OCI and how does the process typically work?
Well, OCI stands for on-campus interviewing, and it kind of has a few different steps. The first step is picking which firms the student wants to bid on, so which firms they're interested in. It could be a large list, it could be a smaller, more specific list. The next step is getting OCI interviews and having, a 20 or 30-minute interview, usually at a hotel or at the school, with one or two lawyers from the firms. And then the next step is getting a call back. So you do well in the first round and then you go back for a full round of interviews at the firm with like a group of people.
Okay. And basically the number of firms that you have available to bid on is going to vary a lot by school. Is that true?
That's definitely true. And the strategy might be different depending on what school you go to.
Yeah, absolutely. So, if you're at a very top school, you're going to have literally hundreds of firms from all over the country who are there, who are eager to talk to you. And if you're at a lower ranked school, the reality is that's just not necessarily going to be the case. And
I'd also add the difference between maybe a top school and a lower ranked school is that usually at a top school, it's all completely random. So the student does pick the firm, but the firm just gets a list of students. At a lower ranked school, a lot of times the firm gets to pick their schedule based on who's interested in them. Let's say half their schedule, 80% of their schedule. So it's a little bit different depending on probably the ranking of your school.
Right. I think that's definitely true. And one of the key points that we're going to make here is you need to know how the process at your school works and what it's based on. So if you're, at Harvard, your bids are basically going to be assigned by lottery. So you can just pick, the firms that you're interested in, and then you'll get randomly assigned to them. But a lot of other places, that's not going to be the case. So you're going to have to meet specific requirements, or you're going to have to get picked by a firm for the interview.
Correct. So your options are probably, a little more open, at a really highly ranked school.
Right, but even then, I think people have to be careful to be realistic, and we'll talk about that in detail. Yeah. Just because you're at Harvard doesn't mean you're going to get an offer at every single firm in the country if you're at the bottom of your class. That's just not the way it works.
Absolutely.
So what factors are people looking at when they're deciding either from the firm perspective, I want to talk to this person in an initial interview, or ultimately, I want to give them an offer?
Well, I think really the firm wants to find the right match for them. Mm-hmm. So kind of different areas like, even if firms don't say it, they usually do have sort of a general grade cutoff or, what they're looking for. So they are going to look at that. They're going to look at location. They're going to look at the interest between what practice areas they have, those sorts of things.
Yeah, and so these are all factors that you, as the person, the student who's bidding, need to be thinking about too. So let's dive into the grade stuff a bit, because I know that's an area of a lot of angst. From your perspective as a former recruiter, how firm are, do the firms actually have grade, like specific grade requirements at different schools, and how firm are those?
So I've been at firms where they do, and I've been at firms where they don't. I've never been at a firm that said what it was, though.
Publicly, you mean?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, because I've seen them internally before.
Yeah, I mean, they're going to say it in a hiring committee meeting or with the recruiter.
I mean, I'll be honest, like Quinn basically just circulated them to the entire firm. Yeah, it was crazy. I don't think they even do OCI now, but at the time it was like, and I mean, to be honest, they were ridiculous. It's like, if you're at Columbia, you need to have like a 3.7 to interview here. It's like, oh, really? Come on.
Yeah, and I've never been at a firm that's that blatant about it.
Well, they're a little weird.
Yeah, I mean, and the other thing is there usually is some leeway, right? So if they say, they tell the interviewer, we're really not looking at anyone with like below a 3.5 at whatever school you're at, you find someone who like you love and you're the interviewer, you want to fight for them, and they have, a 3.45, they might be able to push them through. They're not going to be able to push someone through with a 3.2.
Right.
So I think you kind of, we did have an idea of what we were looking at, and it did depend on what the school was, because especially these days, a lot of schools don't even have exact grades.
Right, that's true. I mean, we were officially not even allowed to calculate our GPA, which is why this list was sort of funny too. After the fact, I was like, people don't even know what their GPA is, actually. Neither do you. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think grades are one of those things that you have to be realistic about when you're bidding. And that's certainly something that's going to play a huge factor, I think, in your strategy, right?
Absolutely. And I think the thing you have to remember is that the interviewer is not going to see your grades until either they get there, or most likely even, I know a lot of people don't even look at the transcript until after they've talked to you. Mm-hmm. So I think you do have the chance to make your impression without them knowing what your grades are. That being said, there's going to be those cutoffs where no matter how much they loved you, they're not going to be able to call you back. So I don't think you want to aim for somewhere that is going to be out of reach, because that's really just a waste.
Right. I mean, it's kind of like how you applied to law school. You've got to have your target school, target firms, your reach firms, and then your safety firms. And it's fine, to mix in a couple where you're like, oh, I'd really love to be at this place, but I know that I'm maybe not exactly in their target demographic in terms of grades. But, a couple of those are fine. You just want to make sure you're not only bidding on those types of places.
And I do know that certain firms, for them to get a student from, like, let's say you're at a top ranked school, but you're not doing that well. For some firms, just having someone from that school is going to be great, and you're going to have a real shot at it. So that's why I do think you have to keep in mind that you probably want some firms that you feel pretty confident you can get through.
Right. And how do students figure this out? I mean, you're saying, okay, well, we had these internal grade cutoffs, but we don't really make them public. I mean, how can they kind of suss out where they're competitive?
Well, I think you should look at the ranking of the firm in the same way that you'd look at a ranking for a school. So, there's the American Lawyer does rank law firms, and it is kind of like a school in that the higher ranked ones, a lot of times are going to have, higher grade cutoffs. So I think that's one way. I also think you can talk to people that have been there. You can talk to, you can see who were their former summers and that sort of thing. But I think a lot of it is just sort of ranking and the prestige factor and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, Wachtell is probably not taking you with a 3.0.
Exactly. That being said, some of the firms, I think another thing to look at is how many summers they've historically taken. So you don't know for sure that they're not cutting back, but I do think that firms with bigger classes, at times are going to be more open because they need to fill them versus a firm who's going to, a really good firm that's only taking 6 summers or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. At that point, you've got to be, very tip top, and also really want to work there. Somehow, I randomly ended up in a first round interview with Wachtell, which I swear to you, I did not put on my schedule because it is like the last place. I mean, you can imagine, like, that is not the right fit for me, right? Like, that's very clear. But somehow, I don't know how, I ended up in this interview, and the guy says to me, so, why do you want to work at Wachtell? And I was like, to be perfectly honest, I really don't think I do.
I really respect you for being honest, though, and not trying to take a spot from somebody.
Well, but then it was this moment where he kind of looked at me and he's like, well,
What
why
are you
not? And so then I told him why not, which was basically, I think their hours requirements are crazy and I just don't think it's a great fit for me. And then he spent the rest of the interview trying to convince me that actually I did want to work there and it wasn't really that bad. And then they didn't give me a call back. So it was just one of those bizarre experiences where you're like, how am I in this interview? I don't know how this happened. I shouldn't be here. What's going on? But whatever. It was one of my interviews. So, having one or two, I probably had like 3 that were really terrible, actually. 2 of them were my fault and one of them wasn't.
Well, I think that's not terrible percentage considering how many interviews you probably did.
Yeah, I didn't do all that many. I probably did like 10 or 15 maybe.
Oh, that is then.
Well, I was just like, you know what? I'm in the law review at Columbia. Like, I'm looking for a job in New York City. Like, how hard can this be? Like, there are plenty of people who want to hire people like me, right?
Yeah.
Which I think, we'll talk about later in terms of strategy. Some people are overconfident. Some people are underconfident. I might have been slightly overconfident, but it was fine. So the other thing, and this actually is my disastrous interview number 2, that people really need to be thinking about in terms of bid strategy is their location, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So for me, in one case, I'd accidentally bid on a firm that was in DC, like their DC office instead of their New York office without realizing it. And I'm in that interview and they say, oh, why do you want to work in DC? And there's that moment of like, DC? Really? Yeah. Okay. I like the Smithsonian. Not a good answer.
Well, and I think actually this can be confusing both on the firm side and on the student side, because I know that some things have changed at OCI where firms are interviewing firm-wide versus for a specific office.
Oh, interesting.
So
talk a bit about that.
Yeah, so that it's sort of a new strategy, which is just have, 3 interviewers interview for that firm just generally. And then they talk specifically with the student about which office you're interested in versus always how they did it, which was, you're interviewing for the DC office, the New York office or whatever. Right. The other thing is sometimes I always found this a waste as a recruiter. People would be in slots for different offices of the same firm, but take up like a slot for each office. Right. And what we always would try to do if we saw that on the schedule was combine it and say, like, you can interview with this person. They know you're interested in both offices. So I would say going into it, definitely make that clear, especially if you're interested in more than one office of the same firm, which I think is a little tricky because you want to be selling them on where you want to be. So if you seem that wishy-washy, like, oh, I could be in LA or New York, Yeah,
I think that's what happened here. I think I actually did interview in their New York office too, and somehow like the box had been checked for DC, and it was one of those things like, why am I doing this twice?
It's such a waste because a lot of these schools, like, we have lots more people we would love to interview with, but we only have one day or we only have this interview, or like we don't want to waste it on 2 people because usually there's not a ton of openings. So I would say like clarify that during bidding, make sure you know who you're interviewing for and which office and all that sort of thing.
I mean, what if people just have absolutely no idea where they want to work?
I would say, pick a couple of markets and have a reason why you want to be there, whether or not it's true. Don't go to too many. I always found that more than 2 markets, it's really hard to sell that. I think it gets confusing for you. I think you don't even remember, where you want to be and why. And you are going to have to answer that question every single time if it's somewhere where like you're not from or you don't go to school there. So you do need like a fairly, consistent strategy. And unless it's like San Francisco and Palo Alto or something, where they're really close together, so it makes sense. I do think it can get a little tricky if you're picking 2 totally different cities.
Yeah, I mean, I was interviewing at firms in New York and firms in San Francisco and apparently occasionally DC. But for me, like, the San Francisco one was legitimate. Like, I had lived there, I'd gone to school there previously, I'd had a job there. And eventually I did actually go back there. But even then, I had a real problem convincing people that I was serious about it because they're looking at my resume and saying, okay, you were at Berkeley and then you worked in San Francisco, but you left. Now you're in law school in New York. Why wouldn't you just take a job in New York? And so even with that background, I still really had to overcome that. And I got far fewer offers in San Francisco than in New York.
Yeah. And I do think, so New York is the one place where I think you don't necessarily have to have that much of a reason, and they may not even ask you, because I think
they just assume, of course you want to be in New York.
Best city in the world. And it's big, and like there's so many firms, and they take kind of the biggest summer classes. So the New York thing, I think you can sell easier. I think what happens in San Francisco, and it's smaller summer classes a lot of times, is that people want to try out San Francisco.
Right.
And so generally a lot of firms have gotten burned there. So they are a lot stricter, and it's going to come up multiple times. So it's going to come up during the OCI interview, it's going to come up during the callback, and then they're going to talk about you in a hiring meeting after. And it's going to come up, like, especially if it's not an obvious connection. Okay, why do they want to be there? And, if they're deciding on between you and somebody else and you're kind of equal, but they don't feel like you have a strong connection, they may not even pick you.
Yeah, I think I got feedback after the fact that basically they just thought I wasn't ready to come back to San Francisco. And that's why after the callback, I didn't get the offer.
So I do think it's on the student to sell that, if that's really what you want. But yeah, if you pick like a whole bunch of different markets, I just don't think it's a good idea.
No, and I think you too. I mean, if you're really not sure where you want to be, but you want some type of firm job, I mean, I think the most obvious thing to do is to interview, if possible, where your law school is located.
Sure.
So if you're at UCLA, like do a bunch of interviews in LA. You don't really have to sell that. As opposed to, New York or wherever, maybe not New York, but, DC, like that's going to be a much harder transition. So you've just got to be strategic. I mean, if you really, really want to be in DC, say for family reasons or your partner's there or whatever, that's fine. Just be aware it's probably going to be a little harder than just getting something in California.
I also think be really careful about anything that makes it seem like you're trying it out,
right?
Or you want to move to a different office. Just saying that right away is never a good idea. I also had a lot of people, well, I have a cousin who I've gone to visit. Like, that's not going to do it either.
Yeah, you need to have something.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think in certain areas, you can sell this in terms of practice area. So say, for example, you really are interested in doing something in technology or IP, something like that, patent litigation. You can sell that to someone in San Francisco or in the Bay Area in Palo Alto. I mean, and that can be an in. I mean, if you're really interested in doing, say, regulatory work, you can sell DC. So you've got to kind of think about what story makes sense, even if maybe it's not 100% you're dead set on doing this, right?
But yeah, and I think a lot of people's background makes sense. Like you're saying, to be in Silicon Valley and you have an engineering background. And so that can sell it, I think, even better, than, I have
your cousin, your aunt.
Or something silly like that. I think like that seems more legit in a lot of ways. The other thing I would do is make sure like how big the office is. Is it the main office? Is it a smaller office?
Right.
Be like ready to answer those questions, because like you don't want to be saying, oh, I really want to be in the headquarters office, and then they're like, but we're not.
Right, we're a satellite office. In fact, we were just purchased, we just merged like 2 years ago. Don't you know this?
Yeah, be really careful about stuff like that. Like, do your background. You're not going to that many firms that you can't, definitely at least for the callback, but know what they are, what they do, what the office is, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just basic respect for the interviewer too. I mean, and it makes you look terrible if you say you want to you're dead set on doing bankruptcy, and they're like, we don't practice bankruptcy.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, okay, well, that was a waste of everyone's 20 to 30 minutes. Thanks.
Well, and they're sitting there all day, and they're seeing 20 students. So yeah, I think that's never a good thing. And I think that's the other thing that can come into play if you're like interviewing in too many markets and like too many different areas you say you're interested in. I think it's really easy to get confused.
Yeah, a friend of mine had a good tip on this. She said that she would make index cards for every firm when she was prepping for her interviews. And so the advantage of that is that then, when she's sitting in the hallway for the 2 or 3 minutes awaiting her turn, she can pull out her index card with basic notes, What type of office is this? How big is it? What are their key practice areas? What are the points I want to make? Where are they located? All of these type of things, so that when she went in, I mean, let's face it, if you're doing 20 or 30 interviews, everyone starts to look the same, but she at least could be like, oh yes, I'm really excited about this case that you guys recently worked on, or I'm really excited about whatever I found on the internet that seems like something I could bring up.
Yeah, I've seen students with that, and I think like being organized is so helpful in these kind of chaotic situations. The other thing is you may not know who your interviewer is until right before.
Oh, if at all.
I mean, there are times, or they just switch. We would try to print out a bio and put it on the door. So at least you had that. So I don't think in an OCI interview they expect you to know a ton about them. I mean, if you were given it ahead of time, it's obviously great if you know a little bit. But, at least if you know ahead of time, look up what their practice area is. But I think it's more important to know more about the firm, because that they expect you to have done your homework on.
Yeah, I think the firm in general is what you're going for with the OCI stuff. And then typically with callbacks, they often will give you the names in advance. And I think there you do want to do some research.
Yes, absolutely.
Another way to organize this that could be amazing is using Trello. So for Trello, you could have every firm you're interviewing with has a card, and you just keep on adding your notes to that. After your interview, you can make yourself some notes saying, how did I like this person? Did I feel like I clicked with them? Here's some questions I might want to bring up the next time around. Even better probably than the note cards.
And I think that's a great visual way to do it, and I think that's really helpful versus just like a spreadsheet where everything kind of looks the same.
Yeah, the advantage of Trello is you can have your list. So, you can have your list for, I bid on this firm, or I want to bid on this firm. I did bid on them. I got the interview. I got the callback. I, got the offer, whatever. So, you can see at a glance really where you are in that process with everyone, and are there people that you maybe need to follow up with or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
All right. Well, let's shift gears a little bit. What kind of common mistakes do you see people making in this process?
Well, one, like we were talking about, bidding on the wrong office, or being confused about, which place they're interviewing with, I think is one thing.
Definitely not a good look. Trust me on this one. You don't want to go into a firm and be like, oh, yeah, I didn't really realize that I was talking about this office or this firm. How did that happen? They're not going to be impressed.
And I think, mistakes happen, but I do think this process is fairly streamlined. So you're not really going to get somewhere that you didn't bid on most of the time. You gave an example, like an outlier.
Well, I'm sure I bid on them. I just didn't mean to.
Yeah.
I clicked the wrong box or whatever.
But I think that's important. Like, we're assuming, we're sending someone over there that, like, if you at least bid on us, that you're somewhat interested. So I think another mistake is kind of wasting everyone's time. Mm-hmm. I think that's never a good idea if you're clearly not interested, or it's clearly your sort of safety place. I think you need to come in as much as you can to every OCI interview, with energy and somewhat excitement about it, because that's what they want to see from you.
I think that's right. And the other thing is you just don't know what's going to happen. So you might think, oh, I can just blow off this firm because they're no big deal, and I'm sure that they're going to want me. But if you go in and you act totally entitled and like you're not interested, they're not going to want you. It doesn't matter what kind of grades you have. Like, they're looking at you as a person that someone has to work with. Yeah. And if you come off as a person who no one would want to work with, they're not going to hire you.
Well, and I'll tell you that I could think of a school we interviewed at that did have rankings, and we interviewed the number one person, and we didn't give them a call back.
Right.
And it was kind of controversial because everyone was like, well, they're number one. It feels like we're supposed to. But they did not do a good job in the interview. So what was the point,
Right. And there's a big disconnect between the ability to get good grades and the ability to be a good lawyer in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
Those don't necessarily overlap.
Absolutely.
Even if you're a person who is at the top of your class, maybe on the law review, whatever it is, like, you still have to sell yourself as a person that they want to hire, and they have a lot of choices. That's the reality.
And I think that's where what you talked about, overconfidence, comes in. That is, not good reflection, on anyone. And I think, especially if you're a top school, I think sometimes you're kind of overcoming that people might think that you already have that in you.
Right.
So I think you want to be humble.
That's exactly the word I was going to use. Like, from my perspective, having done interviews, if you see someone coming from a top school, you want to see that person who's humble, who seems like they're trainable, who seems like they're going to try hard, because you know they're smart, but that's not the point.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of mistakes, I think people make a lot in terms of bidding is either wasting a bunch of bids on firms where they're just not competitive, or on the flip side, doing like a really absurd amount of interviews when you're a very strong candidate. If you're like at a top school, you're on your law review, you don't need to do like 50 or 100 interviews. Like, that's just crazy.
I remember one school, a very good school in the Bay Area, where the person was bragging that they had done over 50 interviews. And I don't think that looked good to anybody. Like, I think everyone was just like, why?
Yeah, why? Like, can't you make up your mind? Like, don't you have any idea what you're looking for?
Well, and it's obviously, if a firm hears that from the student, it's like, oh, we're not special. Why would we think that we're like one of your top choices?
Right, and it looks rude to your classmates. Like, why are you taking those spots from somebody who might really need them to get that job?
And I'll tell you that firms think about things like that with OCI bidding or offers or things like that, that people are respectful and that, they really are interested in all the things they're looking at. And I get you're going to have places that you're more excited about than others. That's fine.
But also you just can't know.
Yeah, but you have to have a legit interest in the place and think you are possibly a fit.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes people, when you go for the callback interviews, you might be really impressed by a place that you didn't actually expect to like that much. But everybody you meet seems amazing and, they're really nice to you. And sometimes you go to the place you think is going to be your absolute top choice and you're like, oh, I just don't get a good vibe here. Like, this is not my scene. And you can't predict that. I mean, how many...
Going into the bidding process, you're really, like, you don't have the people side of things usually, that much. So we really are just basing it mostly on just information you have about, like, what we were talking about.
Rumor and innuendo.
Yeah, exactly.
Other mistakes, I think, just general lack of clarity. We've talked about this. Like, you need to know, or at least pretend you know what you're looking for. Because a firm that senses that you're super wishy-washy, they're not going to be impressed. And it's not that you need to be, say, oh, the only thing I've ever wanted to do in my entire life is to be a patent litigator. I mean, if that's true, great. But, you at least need an answer of, oh, are you thinking about corporate or litigation?
And I will say that I think anyone who's too committed to an area, except in a situation where they have a very specific background, if they're too into one very specific thing, first of all, I don't think firms believe it. Because they're like, how do you know that much?
Right. Like, what do you know about this?
And also, if you're too tied to it, it's like, well, they say they want to do international law. We have a small practice group. We can't guarantee it to them. Let's not even waste our time.
Right. Yeah,
so that's dangerous, I think, being too specific. But I do think usually at that point, you're litigation or corporate.
Right. And it's fine to say, oh, I'm interested in doing corporate work. It would be great to do some international M&A deals, but, I'd be fine with doing regular M&A too. Like, that's broad enough that they're like, oh, okay, we can do M&A.
Yeah. I also think it's actually okay to say, for example, if you really feel strongly that you're litigation, like, I really think I'm leaning towards litigation, but I'd love to try a corporate assignment during the summer. People love that. Like that, I don't know, because it makes you feel like, it makes the firm feel like, oh, they'd be flexible.
Right. Unless you're interviewing at a firm that doesn't have a corporate practice, in which case, don't say that. So they'll be like, yeah, that's not possible.
You better know what their areas are. That's certainly important. But I would say you want to, have some interest, but not be like too wedded to anything.
Exactly. You want to make it seem like you've thought about this and you have some story, but at the same time, be flexible because, you never know. You might try stuff and realize you really like it. You might try stuff and realize you don't like it. The firm's practice might change before you start there. I mean, obviously, probably not, they're not going to stop doing litigation or stop doing corporate if they do that. But, within that, certain areas might shift. People might leave. You just never know.
Yeah. So generally just seeming flexible, I think, is a good idea.
Yeah, basically, that's a good look for any of these interviews. You are enthusiastic, you are hardworking, you are flexible, you are eager to please. That's what we're going for.
And you are interested in that actual firm, and you know their name, and you know where their office is, and all of that stuff.
Exactly. You've actually thought about this.
Yep.
So how important is your resume in this whole process?
It is key.
Okay.
So this is the thing. I think your resume, I doubt anything about it is going to be so amazing that people are going to remember that she had the best resume I've ever seen.
No, they remember the opposite.
Yeah, it can really hurt you. It's kind of how I feel about thank you notes. So I think that really what you want is just a straightforward, to the point resume that has no mistakes, that is formatted correctly, everything lines up, it clearly tells a story. If there's any holes in it, you know where they are and you know how you're going to address them. And generally, it should not be more than one page. So I think you just want to make sure your resume is perfect for you.
Right.
It should be. You have plenty of time to work on it.
Exactly. And this can get a tiny bit tricky, as we talked about, if you're applying to, say, 2 different offices of the same firm. Do you send them a different resume with a different address? That's a common trick. Like, oh, I have an address in San Francisco. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't think you want to do anything too tricky. I think it's okay to potentially use a different address, not for the same firm.
Yeah, I think it's fine if you're sending them to different firms. I think you probably don't want to do it if you're sending it to different offices of the same firm, because I'm sure you guys all talk to each other, right? Yeah,
and it's all going to get entered into the same system, and people are just going to be confused. So I also think, like, whatever, even if you're sending to different firms, the address needs to be legit. So it needs to be either, if it's where your parents live, you cannot give the address of some family member that, you know,
your aunt.
Yeah, like, don't do that. That's like, seems like lying. So yeah, I think you have to, especially when it's the same firm, I think you have to stick with the same resume. And hopefully, if you're picking 2 different offices, your resume tells a story where 2 offices might make sense. Like, it might make sense that you were in either place.
Yeah, I think it totally could make sense. You could be in either place. I'm just not sure. Sending them the different versions of your resume is a particularly great plan. Just keep it consistent. I think consistency, another consistency point is make sure everything online about you supports what is on your resume. So, for example, your LinkedIn profile basically needs to correspond to what's on your resume, because it's possible someone might Google you. Google yourself from an incognito browser so you can see what's going to come up. I mean, if there are things that you're concerned about, now is the time to deal with those. If you want to try to get them removed from Google or whatever, or just create different content. But, it's totally possible that people are going to put your name in a search engine and you want to know what's going to come up.
And another thing, even if you're private on Facebook, 1, make sure your profile picture looks appropriate. And 2, just keep in mind that just because you're private doesn't mean somebody doesn't know you that can see all your stuff. So think about that.
Right, or know a friend of a friend, or people screenshot things. Just be careful. Clean up your online presence before you go into these interviews. How about people, this is something I ran into a lot with friends of mine, how about if they're not even sure that you want to work in a firm? A lot of these people did end up summering there. How do the firms view people like that? Your resume is all public.
Yeah,
your resume is all public interest. First summer you did public interest. You did like Teach for America before law school. Do they have a bigger hurdle to overcome?
They do. I'm going to say that.
It makes sense, right?
I know I looked at lots of resumes, and it's like, I love public interest. You know what I mean? I think that's great if that's what you want to do. But I would look at a resume immediately and say, this person wants to do public interest. So I think, it's something you're going to have to overcome. It's a story you're going to need to have to tell. Don't go into it saying, how much pro bono do you do?
Yeah, probably not the right first question.
Yeah, but you would be surprised how many people do that.
Yeah, that's one of the things you can talk about after you have the offer, when you ask to go back and talk with more people.
Exactly. But I think you are going to need a story, and you're going to need to sell that, this is a business. They're around to make money, and they're going to do corporate work, and that's what you want to do, and this is why. And I think, like, lots of public interest places give you great experience. just generally that you can talk about how you want to use that. But I do think, it's probably something to really like bring up and they're going to ask you.
Yeah, obviously. And there's certain areas I think it's a harder sell than others. I mean, say, for example, all of your pre-law school work and your first summer was all in environmental public interest work. You really probably cannot go to a firm and tell them that you want to do the type of environmental law they do, because you're going to be on the other side and it just doesn't make sense.
Well, and some students don't even know that.
I know. Trust me, if you're getting paid big law dollars, you're going to be on the other side of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some students, I have had students where it's like, oh, you don't even understand. And then we're totally not interested because you don't understand what we do or why we're doing it or exactly which side we're on. So explain why you want to be on the other side, why you want to learn that part of it.
Right. Or just say you want to switch to some completely different, more neutral practice area.
Yeah. But I think that just generally, if you're looking in big law or you're looking at, just actually it doesn't even have to be big law, but any law firm who's, working on the side of the corporation or whatnot, that like why they're in business, what they do, and that's what you want to do.
And how they make money and who pays them.
Exactly. So I think highlighting like all your pro bono work or your volunteer work or all the good things you do, I mean, I don't think you want to like make that the focus of your resume.
No, I think it needs to be more like, oh, I learned all these amazing negotiation skills in this clinic that I did, or direct legal services, whatever it is. I learned a lot about writing briefs when I wrote this brief for the Environmental Defense Fund, All right, so we're running out of time here. What if you don't get the interviews you want in the bidding? Is there anything people can do after the fact to massage that?
There absolutely is. And I think this is the biggest trick that law students may not even realize, which is that you can contact the firm directly and try to get an interview.
Wow.
And I was always shocked at the number of students that didn't do that. Mm-hmm. So really all you need to do is reach out to, the recruiter who will be listed on the NALP form or, hiring partner or maybe someone you have a connection to there. And just say, I didn't get an interview. I would love to be put on your OCI schedule or come into the office for a screen interview. I think that's great. You can also go to the hospitality suite during on-campus interviewing. At a lot of schools, they have this. So a firm will kind of rent a room and say, I didn't get an interview. I really want to drop off my materials. Sit and chat with people. They usually have attorneys in there, the recruiter. So I think all of that shows a lot of interest. And I would say that probably 75% of the time I would find a spot for that person.
Yeah, I mean, if it's somebody who seems to have a real interest and they're in your zone of people you consider, why not?
I do think, and I don't know what the rules are at all schools, but in that situation, you probably have to give them your grades to get on the schedule. So make sure you do have your resume and your transcript. So even though they're not getting the grades ahead of time, when the bidding process is going on, in this situation, it's outside of that. So they have to really decide whether they want to put you on. And so they do need to know that. And they're not going to probably put you on if it seems like, you're not even in their range. And that's probably best for everybody because why waste anyone's time?
Yeah, exactly. Why waste time? All right. Speaking of time, any final tips for our listeners before we sign off?
Really, the tip I want to repeat is be interested, be positive, and have some energy going into the interview, because that is really the thing that people come out of it with. You need to have certain grades and be at a certain school maybe for firms, but you are going to start to blend into everybody else. And so I think the people that are remembered in a day of like 22 interviews are the people that they had a nice chat with.
Yeah, exactly. And I think too, you need to think about the things in your background, whether it's your resume or whatever it is. Anything on there that's weird, you need to have a story for. And you can tell the exact same story to every single person you interview with. That is not a problem. But you need to have a story so that you're not caught like the deer in the headlights when somebody says, tell me about this one grade, or tell me about, this transition that doesn't really make sense. I mean, my background was super weird. I went from sociology to architecture to programming to law. So, of course, the very first question in 95% of my interviews was, tell me about that. So I had to have a story ready to go, and I had one, and it worked fine. But, if you're just sitting there like, oh gosh, how do I explain this? Like, you need to think about that beforehand.
Yeah, because you really are selling yourself, and maybe practice that story to somebody even who doesn't know that much about your background and say, how does this sound?
Yeah, exactly. You can try out different variants until you get the one where everyone's like, oh yeah, that totally makes sense. I'll buy that. And also I can sell that, so when the recruiter comes to be like, are we sure we want this person? Like, they have a really weird background. They can remember like, oh no, but this is the story they told me about that. Makes it more memorable.
It might be really memorable.
Exactly. You're like the weird one.
And also, one more thing, please don't have any typos on anything.
Please.
I don't care how many people you have to, review it. There should not be even one typo.
Yeah, it's pretty much deadly just because lawyers are detail oriented. That's what you're getting paid for.
Yep.
It's not one of those things people will forgive. It's just not.
Nope.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Sadie, for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, our pleasure. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app because we'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Allison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com. Or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Also, we offer personal career coaching, including resume reviews, so your resume can be perfect, OCI strategy, interview tips, all of that. So if you're interested, check out careerdicta.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.